Lion begs man for help. You won't believe what happened next. The sun blazed mercilessly over the vast Serengeti plains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. James Harrington wiped the sweat from his brow, adjusting his khaki shirt as he surveyed the terrain through his binoculars. As a wildlife photographer with 20 years of experience documenting the majestic creatures of Africa, he thought he had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness that fateful afternoon. 3 weeks into his latest expedition, James had ventured farther from camp than usual, drawn by reports of a rare pride of lions that local guides claimed exhibited unusual behavioral patterns. The conservation project he worked for was particularly interested in documenting their movements, as lion populations continued to face threats across the continent. "Just a little farther," he muttered to himself, checking his GPS coordinates against the hand-drawn map provided by Kibwe, his trusted guide, who had remained at the base camp with a minor injury. The acacia trees dotting the landscape provided occasional respite from the relentless heat, their distinctive silhouettes a reminder of nature's artistry. James stopped abruptly, his trained ear catching a sound that seemed out of place amidst the typical symphony of the savannah. It wasn't the distant rumble of elephants or the familiar calls of birds that had become the soundtrack to his professional life. This was different, a deep, pained growl followed by what could only be described as a desperate plea. Cautiously advancing toward the source, James kept his movements slow and deliberate. Years in the field had taught him the delicate balance between curiosity and survival. As he crested a small rise covered in tall grass, he froze at the sight before him. Not 30 yards away, a magnificent lioness stood facing him, her amber eyes locked with his in a gaze that transcended the natural barriers between predator and prey, between wild and human. But it wasn't her imposing presence that made James's heart pound against his ribcage. It was what hung precariously from the branch of a gnarled old acacia tree behind her. A massive African rock python, its scales glistening with intricate patterns in the afternoon light, had wrapped itself around a young lion cub. The snake's powerful coils threatened to extinguish the life from the small creature with each passing second. The cub's desperate struggles were weakening, its small frame no match for the python's crushing embrace. The lioness before James paced anxiously, occasionally looking up at her offspring with what could only be described as maternal anguish. Then back to James. In his decades documenting wildlife, he had never witnessed anything like this silent communication, this desperate plea for intervention. "Osh, this is impossible," James whispered, his mind racing through everything he knew about lion behavior. Lionesses were fiercely protective and self-sufficient. They didn't seek human help. Yet here was this majestic creature, seemingly communicating her desperate need for assistance. If you're as fascinated by wildlife interactions as I am, please leave a comment below about your most memorable animal encounter. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more extraordinary stories from the wild. James stood at a crossroads of decision. The ethical guidelines of wildlife photography and conservation were clear. Non-intervention was the golden rule. Nature's course, however brutal, was to be observed, not altered. Humans were witnesses, not participants in the delicate balance of predator and prey. Yet something in the lioness's eyes challenged everything he believed about the boundaries between humans and wild animals. She emitted another low growl, then took several steps backward, as if inviting him to approach. Behavior so contrary to everything he knew about these apex predators that James questioned his own perception. With trembling hands, James set down his camera equipment. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered, reaching for the satellite phone to call for advice, only to find it dead. The decision was his alone. Drawing a deep breath, he removed his outer shirt, leaving only a thin undershirt between his skin and the scorching sun. He knew that pythons, while dangerous, typically reserved their constricting power for prey, not for defense against larger threats. His plan was desperate and fraught with risk, but the clock was ticking for the young cub. "Easy now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the lioness, the python, or himself. Each step forward sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. The lioness remained unnaturally still, her eyes never leaving him, her body tense but not threatening. As James approached the tree, the python shifted slightly, adjusting its grip on the increasingly limp cub. With careful movements, James unfurled his shirt and, using a branch he'd picked up along the way, attempted to wedge the fabric between the snake's coils and the cub's body. The technique, something he'd once observed a herpetologist use to release a constricted research animal, was his only hope. The python's head swiveled toward him, its cold, unblinking eyes assessing this new threat. James held his breath as he continued to work the fabric between the powerful coils, creating just enough space to potentially free the cub. The snake, sensing the disruption to its meal, began to loosen its grip ever so slightly. Come on," James urged under his breath, working with painstaking precision. One wrong move could redirect the python's attention and its defensive strike toward him. Equally concerning was the lioness, whose behavior defied all natural expectations. She continued her vigil at a distance, tense, but allowing this strange intervention to proceed. After what seemed like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, James felt the python's grip slacken further. The snake, perhaps deciding this meal wasn't worth the trouble, began to slowly unwind itself from around the cub. With one final push of effort, James managed to create enough space for the young lion to slip free, tumbling unceremoniously to the ground below with a soft thud. The python, its meal now lost, retreated further into the branches of the acacia, clearly reassessing the situation. James backed away slowly, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it was audible across the plains. The cub lay motionless on the ground, and for a moment James feared they had been too late. Then, almost imperceptibly, the small ribcage expanded with a shallow breath. The lioness approached her offspring with caution, nudging the small form with her nose. The cub responded with a weak mewl that sent a wave of relief through James, so powerful that his knees nearly buckled. As he continued to retreat, putting much-needed distance between himself and the wild animals, the lioness did something that would forever change his understanding of these magnificent creatures. She looked up directly at him, and for a brief moment their eyes met again. There was something in that gaze, a connection, an understanding, perhaps even gratitude, that transcended species. Then, gently taking her cub by the scruff of the neck, she carried it away toward the safety of a nearby thicket. James remained rooted to the spot long after they had disappeared from view, his mind struggling to process what had just transpired. Had he imagined that look of recognition, of mutual respect? Was it merely the projection of human emotion onto an animal acting on pure instinct? Or had he glimpsed something more profound, a moment of cross-species communication that defied scientific explanation? As the adrenaline slowly ebbed from his system, James collected his equipment with shaking hands. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the savannah. He needed to return to camp before darkness fell, yet he found himself lingering, forever changed by the encounter. That night, as he recounted the experience to a skeptical Kibwe around the campfire, James struggled to find the words to convey the depth of what had occurred. "Now I know how it sounds," he said, noting the look of disbelief on his guide's weathered face. "If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either." "In my people's traditions," Kibwe said thoughtfully, poking at the embers of their fire, "there are stories of the great cats choosing certain humans as their allies. These relationships are sacred, meant to bridge the world of man and beast. Perhaps you have been chosen, my friend." James smiled, but said nothing, his mind replaying the intensity of the lioness's gaze, the silent communication that had passed between them. Whether Kibwe's explanation held any truth or not, James knew that something extraordinary had occurred, something that defied the neat categories of scientific observation that had defined his career. In the days that followed, James found himself drawn back to the area, hoping for another glimpse of the lioness and her cub. His cameras remained ready, but somehow, capturing the moment on film seemed less important than it once had. Some experiences, he was beginning to realize, weren't meant to be documented, but simply lived. On the 5th day after the encounter, as James was preparing to relocate to another observation point, he spotted them, the lioness and her cub, accompanied now by 2 other females from their pride. They moved with purpose across the open plain, the young cub bouncing with renewed energy and life. James raised his telephoto lens, capturing frame after frame of their movement, their interactions, their family dynamics. As if sensing his presence, the lioness paused, her head turning in his direction. Despite the considerable distance between them, James felt that same connection, that same recognition. She lingered for a moment, allowing him this window into her world before continuing on with her family. That evening, reviewing the photographs in his tent, James noticed something that had escaped his attention in the moment. In several frames, clearly visible despite the distance, was a distinctive scar across the lioness's right flank, a mark he recognized from conservation records as belonging to a lioness named Aisha by researchers, one of the oldest and most successful mothers in this region of the Serengeti. Further research revealed something that sent chills down his spine. 3 years earlier, a different wildlife team had documented Aisha with a severe leg injury, likely from a snare set by poachers. The team's veterinarian had tranquilized her and removed the snare, potentially saving her life. The photographs from that intervention showed a distinctive feature on the vet's uniform, the same Conservation Project logo that James wore on his own field shirt. She recognized the logo, James whispered to himself, the realization dawning with startling clarity. She associated humans wearing this symbol with help. While scientifically unprovable, the possibility that Aisha had made this connection, that she had sought help from someone she identified as potentially beneficial based on past experience, wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. Lions were intelligent, capable of complex social interactions and long memories. Perhaps this wasn't divine intervention or mystical selection, but rather a magnificent example of animal cognition and adaptive behavior. James spent the remainder of his expedition documenting Aisha's pride, gathering data that would prove invaluable to conservation efforts in the region. His paper on the potential for recognition and memory in lions, while controversial in some scientific circles, opened new avenues of research into animal cognition and human-wildlife interactions. But beyond the scientific implications, the experience had transformed James on a personal level. The boundaries he had carefully maintained between observer and subject, between human and animal, had been irreversibly blurred. In Aisha's eyes, he had glimpsed not just the wild spirit of a predator, but a consciousness, different from his own, yet no less profound. Years later, long after his formal research in the Serengeti had concluded, James would return to those same plains, drawn by a connection he couldn't fully articulate. And there, in the golden light of another African sunset, he would catch glimpses of a pride led by a young male lion with distinctive markings. The same cub whose life had hung in the balance that fateful day, now grown into the majesty of adulthood. Life in the savannah continued its ancient rhythms of survival, predator and prey, birth and death. But within that timeless cycle, James had witnessed something extraordinary. a moment when the boundaries between species fell away, revealing the complex web of relationships that bind all living things. As he watched the young male lion lead his pride across the plains, James felt a sense of completion, of having been part of something larger than himself. In saving one life, he had influenced generations to come, contributing in his small way to the ongoing story of life on the Serengeti. And in the end, wasn't that the most any of us could hope for? To know that our actions, however small, might echo through time, touching lives beyond our understanding, creating ripples in the vast ocean of existence that continue long after we ourselves have returned to dust. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a lion roared, a sound of power, of presence, of life continuing its eternal cycle. James smiled and packed away his camera. Some moments didn't need to be captured on film. They were etched instead upon the heart, carried forward in memory and in story. And so the tale of the lion who sought help from a man would live on, a reminder of the extraordinary connections possible in this world if only we open ourselves to them. In a time when humans and wildlife face unprecedented challenges coexisting on our shared planet, perhaps such stories of connection across species barriers offer not just hope, but a pathway forward, a recognition that our fates are intertwined in ways we are only beginning to understand. As darkness fell completely over the Serengeti, James made his way back to camp, carrying with him not just photographs and data, but a story of an impossible moment of trust between man and lion that had changed them both forever. And in that story lived a truth more powerful than scientific fact, that compassion knows no species barrier, that connection can occur in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes, in helping others, we discover the very best of what makes us human.